The Arctic winter had swallowed the sun weeks ago, leaving the New York Allison research station in a twilight gloom that never lifted. Dr. Elara Vance, the station's physician and one of 12 people stranded there, stood by the narrow window of her quarters, staring at the ice stretching into infinite darkness. The wind howled against the insulated panels, a sound she had learned to ignore, a constant percussion that had become the heartbeat of isolation. What she could not ignore was the body she had examined an hour earlier. Dr. Aris Thorne, the senior climatologist, lay on a steel table in the medical bay, his face frozen in an expression of mild surprise, as if death had interrupted a thought mid-formation. Officially, it was an accident, a fall down the icy stairs near the atmospheric observatory. Unofficially, Elara had noticed the bruising pattern on his neck, the faint petechial hemorrhages in his eyes that spoke of strangulation, not a fall. She had said nothing when she filed the preliminary report, her hand steady as she typed, her mind already cataloging the discrepancy. The storm that had severed all communication with the outside world was expected to last 12 more days. 12 days with 11 other people, one of whom was a killer. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and made a silent promise to herself, she would not be the next accident. Elara returned to the common room, where the remaining crew had gathered around the long wooden table, cups of instant coffee growing cold in their hands. The room smelled of recycled air and anxiety. She saw the usual faces: Eric, the taciturn engineer who kept the station's life support running, his thick fingers wrapped around a mug; Hannah, the geologist who rarely spoke above a whisper, her eyes fixed on a crack in the wall; Matteo, the communications officer rendered useless by the magnetic storm, nervously tapping his thumb against his thigh; Fatima, the biologist obsessed with extremophiles, clutching a tablet as if it were a shield, and the others each carrying their own quiet shock, each avoiding direct eye contact. The station manager, a man named Soren Jorgensen, stood at the head of the table, his voice steady as he explained that an investigation would wait until the storm passed. He spoke of protocol, of patience, of the importance of maintaining routine. Elara watched Soren carefully. He had been the one to find Aris at the bottom of the stairs. He had been too quick to call it an accident, too eager to close the chapter before it could be opened. When the meeting ended, Elara lingered, pretending to organize her medical kit. She pulled up the station's internal monitoring system on a tablet: video feeds, motion sensors, door logs. The AI, an interface called Aris, Arctic Remote Intelligence System, had recorded everything. She typed a query: location of Dr. Aris Thorne, last 6 hours before incident. The answer appeared in stark white text. Her stomach tightened. The log showed that Aris had been in Soren's office 40 minutes before his death. The door sensor registered both their access cards. Elara scrolled further. 3 hours earlier, Aris had accessed a restricted archive, one containing financial audits of the station's funding. She knew the station was part of an international polar research consortium, with budgets from multiple countries, a complex web of grants and allocations that few people bothered to scrutinize. She had never paid attention to the money side. Her role was medical. Her expertise lay in keeping people alive in extreme conditions. But Aris had. And now he was dead. She closed the tablet and walked toward Soren's office, her footsteps muffled by the rubber flooring, the corridor lit by flickering LED strips that had seen better years. The door was locked. Through the small window, she could see papers scattered across his desk, as if someone had searched for something in a hurry, leaving the aftermath of urgency. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She spun around. Matteo stood in the dim corridor, his face half illuminated by a red emergency light, his expression unreadable. "You should be careful," he said quietly. "Accidents happen easily here." He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps fading into the hum of the ventilation system. Elara's pulse hammered. She returned to her quarters and spent the night reviewing every archived file the AI could retrieve, her eyes burning as the Arctic darkness pressed against the window. By morning, though morning was indistinguishable from night, a mere shift in the schedule, Elara had found the thread. Tucked inside the station's financial records was a shell company registered in a jurisdiction with lax oversight, a name buried under layers of corporate obfuscation. Funds intended for climate research had been rerouted in small, undetectable amounts over 3 years. The total was substantial, enough to change a life several times over. The signatures authorizing the transfers belonged to the station's former manager, but the IP addresses traced back to Soren's current terminal. Eris had discovered it and confronted Soren. Now Eris was dead. Elara saved everything to a separate encrypted drive, her fingers cold despite the gloves she wore. As she did, a knock came at her door. It was Fatima, her face pale beneath her dark hair, her breathing rapid. "The generator shed," Fatima said. "Someone sabotaged the backup fuel line. If the main unit fails, we have less than 48 hours before the station goes cold." Elara followed her through the dark corridors, their breath misting in the increasingly frigid air. In the shed, she saw the cut hose, the puddle of frozen diesel, the deliberate neatness of the incision. This was no accident. Someone was systematically disabling the station, and with communications down, they were all trapped in a slowly failing cage. Elara looked at Fatima. "Who else knows about this?" Fatima hesitated. "I told Soren first. He said he would handle it." Elara's suspicion hardened into certainty. Elara knew she could not confront Soren directly without proof that would convince the others. She decided to use the AI's passive monitoring to catch him in a lie. She accessed Eris's audio logs. The system recorded ambient sound in common areas for safety purposes, a feature meant to assist in emergencies. She filtered for Soren's voice in the hours after Eris's death. What she found was a fragment, Soren speaking to someone in the supply closet, his voice low but audible against the hum of the ventilation. The files were on his personal drive. "I deleted them, but he might have made copies." "Find them. Search his quarters. Do it now." The second voice was too muffled to identify. Elara played it again, adjusting the equalization, her ear straining against the static. The cadence was familiar. She ran through a mental list of the remaining crew. It was not Eric, whose speech was slow and deliberate, a man of few words. It was not Hannah, whose voice was always soft, almost swallowed by the environment. Then it clicked, the clipped, efficient tone belonged to Matteo. The communications officer, whose silence had seemed so harmless, whose nervous tapping had seemed like ordinary anxiety. Elara realized she had made a critical error. If Matteo was complicit, then the communications blackout might not be entirely natural. She hurried to the communications hub and found the main console intact but the auxiliary transmitter's circuit board missing, pulled out, the empty slot a gaping void. Without it, even when the storm cleared, they could not call for help. She was alone. Elara retreated to the medical bay, the only room she could lock from the inside with a deadbolt she had installed herself months ago for pharmaceutical security. She sat with her back against the wall, the encrypted drive pressed against her palm, its edges digging into her skin. She needed allies, but she did not know who to trust. She thought of Hannah, the geologist who kept to herself, who spent hours examining core samples and never joined the after-dinner conversations. Hannah had no obvious connection to the financial scheme, but she also had no obvious reason to help. She thought of Eric, whose loyalty was to the machinery, not to people. She thought of Fatima, who had come to her with the sabotage, but Fatima had gone to Soren first, which could mean innocence or something more calculated. Elara forced herself to breathe. She pulled up Eris again, this time searching for any pattern that might indicate who else had accessed the financial archives before Eris. The log showed 2 other names, Soren himself, repeatedly, and a single access from Hannah's terminal 3 months earlier. Elara's heart rate quickened. She left the medical bay, moving through the corridors with deliberate silence, and knocked on Hannah's door. When Hannah opened it, her expression was guarded, but she stepped aside without a word. Elara entered and closed the door behind her. "You looked at the financial audits," Elara said. "3 months ago. What did you see?" Hannah's eyes widened, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Hannah motioned for Elara to sit on the edge of her narrow bunk, then closed the blinds over the small window. "I saw the shell company," Hannah whispered. "I didn't understand it at first. I thought it was a mistake in the accounting. When I asked Eris about it, he told me to stay quiet until he had all the evidence." She paused, her hands trembling. "He was going to confront Soren 2 days ago. He never came back." Elara studied her. Hannah's fear seemed genuine, her voice cracking on the words. "Why didn't you come to me after he died?" Elara asked. Hannah shook her head. "I didn't know who else was involved. I thought if Soren killed Eris, he wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who knew. I was trying to survive." She looked up, her eyes wet. "But now the station is falling apart. The heat is dropping. If we don't do something, we'll all freeze before the storm ends." Elara made a decision. She told Hannah about the audio log, about Mateo's involvement, about the missing circuit board. Hannah listened without interrupting, her face growing paler. "We need to get that transmitter board back," Elara said. "And we need to expose Soren in front of the others before he and Mateo can cause more damage." Hannah nodded slowly. "Eric might help. He's not part of this. He hates Soren for cutting the maintenance budget." Elara agreed. But they had to move carefully. The 2 women sat in the dim light, planning, as the temperature inside the station continued its slow, imperceptible decline. Elara and Hannah found Eric in the engineering bay, surrounded by gauges and blinking indicators, his face lit by the pale glow of the control panels. He listened without expression as Elara laid out what she had discovered: the financial fraud, the audio log, the missing circuit board. When she finished, Eric let out a long breath, the air clouding in front of his face. "I wondered why the backup fuel line was cut," he said. "No one knows that system better than me. It was done by someone who wanted us to freeze slowly, not all at once." He glanced at the temperature readout. "We've lost 3 degrees in the last 6 hours. If the main generator fails, we have maybe 30 hours. He turned to Elara. "What's your plan?" Elara explained that they needed to retrieve the auxiliary transmitter board from wherever Mateo had hidden it. She also needed to download the full Eris logs as irrefutable evidence. The audio file alone was enough to implicate Soren, but she wanted everything. Eric nodded. "I can create a distraction. A fake alarm in the main generator room. It'll pull both Soren and Mateo there, at least for a few minutes. That's when you search their quarters." Hannah volunteered to search Soren's office while Elara searched Mateo's room. They agreed to reconvene in the medical bay in 20 minutes. As they left the engineering bay, Elara felt a surge of cold that had nothing to do with the failing heaters. She was about to openly declare war on two people who had already killed once. Failure was not an option. The alarm blared through the station at the appointed time, a harsh klaxon that echoed off the metal walls. Eric's voice came over the internal speakers, calm but urgent: main generator fluctuation. All engineering personnel to the generator room. Elara watched from the corridor as Soren and Matteo emerged from their respective doors, exchanging a quick glance before hurrying toward the generator bay. She waited until their footsteps faded, then slipped into Matteo's room. It was sparse: a bed, a desk, a small closet. She searched quickly, her hands moving through drawers and compartments. Under the mattress, she found a padded envelope containing the missing circuit board, its gold connectors gleaming. She also found a notebook filled with handwritten notes about the station's schedules, patrol routes, and the personal habits of each crew member. It was a surveillance log, methodical and chilling. She pocketed the circuit board and the notebook, then left. Across the station, Hannah was doing the same in Soren's office. When Elara arrived at the medical bay, Hannah was already there, breathless, holding a stack of printed documents. "Bank transfer confirmations," Hannah said. "He kept copies. And there's something else." She pulled out a photograph, a group shot of Soren, Matteo, and two other people Elara did not recognize, standing in front of a yacht. "They'd been doing this for years," Hannah said. "Not just here. Different stations, different countries." Elara examined the photograph. The faces of Soren and Matteo were relaxed, smiling. It was the smile of men who believed they would never be caught. Elara placed the circuit board on the table. "We have everything we need. Now we end this." Elara gathered the remaining crew in the common room, leaving Soren and Matteo still occupied with the fake generator alarm. She stood before them, Eric, Hannah, Fatima, and the others, and laid out the evidence in clear, measured terms. She played the audio log, the fragment of Soren's voice unmistakable. She showed the financial documents, the shell company, the transfer confirmations. She displayed the notebook from Matteo's room, its pages documenting the crew's vulnerabilities. She explained that Eris had been murdered for discovering the scheme, and that the sabotage to the station was meant to ensure no one survived to tell the story. When she finished, silence filled the room. Fatima was the first to speak. "I told Soren about the fuel line. He said he'd handle it. He was going to let us freeze." Her voice was raw with betrayal. The others murmured in agreement, their faces hardening. Eric stepped forward. "We need to detain them. Now." He handed Elara a toolkit containing zip ties used for securing cargo. At that moment, the corridor door opened. Soren entered, followed by Matteo. Soren's expression shifted from irritation to alarm as he took in the scene, the assembled crew, the documents spread across the table, the zip ties in Eric's hands. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Elara stepped forward. "Soren Jorgensen, you are under citizen's arrest for the murder of Dr. Eris Thorne, fraud, and attempted murder of this crew. The evidence is here, and there is nowhere for you to go." Matteo bolted first. He turned and ran down the corridor toward the emergency exit, his boots slamming against the metal floor. Eric and two other crew members gave chase. Soren stood frozen for a moment, then made a different choice. He lunged for the evidence table, reaching for the documents, perhaps hoping to destroy what he could. Elara stepped in front of him, her medical training the only thing keeping her voice steady. "It's over. The files are backed up on a secure drive. Destroying these won't change anything." Soren's face twisted with rage, but he stopped. The sound of struggle echoed from the corridor, then Eric's voice got him. Minutes later, Matteo was brought back, his hands secured behind his back, his earlier composure shattered. Eric and the others secured both men to the metal supports in the supply closet, a temporary holding cell with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. Elara watched as Soren was led away, his gaze meeting hers for a brief moment. There was no remorse in his eyes, only calculation, already assessing what he would say when the storm cleared and the authorities arrived. But Elara did not need his confession. She had the evidence. And more importantly, she had kept the remaining 10 people alive. She returned to the medical bay and installed the auxiliary transmitter circuit board with Eric's help. The storm still raged outside, but when it cleared, they would be ready. The next days were a test of endurance. With Soren and Matteo secured, the remaining crew took shifts monitoring the generator, rationing heat, and maintaining the fragile systems that kept them alive. Elara checked on the prisoners twice a day, ensuring they had water and enough warmth to survive, not out of kindness, but because she would not let them become martyrs. She spent hours with the Eris logs, compiling a comprehensive report that detailed every transaction, every lie, every manipulation. Hannah helped her organize the financial evidence, and Eric kept the station running with the precision of a man who had spent decades mastering the unforgiving polar environment. The storm did not relent quickly. The magnetic interference that had cut their communications continued for 8 more days, the wind never dropping below a howl. But on the 9th day, Elara stood at the communications console and saw the signal indicator flicker to green. She keyed the transmitter and sent a priority distress call to the Norwegian Polar Institute, summarizing the situation in stark terms: murder, fraud, the station compromised. The response came within hours. A rescue helicopter would depart as soon as weather permitted. Elara sat back in the chair, exhaustion settling into her bones. Outside, for the first time in weeks, a sliver of pale blue appeared on the horizon. The sun was returning. On the 12th day, the helicopter arrived. Elara watched from the common room window as it descended through the pale light, its rotors kicking up plumes of snow. The crew gathered their personal belongings, but Elara lingered for a moment, looking at the station that had become a prison and then, finally, a place of resolution. She thought of Eris, whose pursuit of truth had cost him his life, and she touched the encrypted drive in her pocket, the evidence that would ensure justice was served. The authorities took Soren and Matteo into custody, their faces blank as they were escorted onto the aircraft. The remaining crew were flown to Longyearbyen, where they were debriefed, examined, and finally released. Elara gave her testimony to investigators, watched as news reports began to circulate about the Arctic fraud and murder case that had shocked the international research community. Months later, she received a letter informing her that Soren and Matteo had been charged with murder, fraud, and attempted murder. Both would face trial. She returned to her life, but the Arctic stayed with her, the endless dark, the wind against the walls, the weight of knowing that in the most isolated place on earth, she had found the strength to stand alone and, in the end, to stand together with those who chose truth over silence. The 12 days that should have been her end became the reason she survived.